An elderly black woman walks through Forsyth Park every morning with the cane her late husband carved by hand. But one day, a white officer demands to inspect it, and when she refuses, he snaps it in half. What he doesn't know, her son is one of the top civil rights attorneys in the country. And this time, silence isn't part of the plan. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. They say the city of Savannah sleeps with one eye open, that its streets remember everything. The Spanish moss that hangs like whispers from the oaks. The cobblestones that have felt generations pass. The scent of magnolia carrying old grief and quiet triumph. But none of that prepared anyone for what was about to happen at precisely 7:06 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. There's something sacred about the stillness before a city wakes. A brief moment when the world holds its breath. And in that silence, Evelyn Monroe walked. She wasn't fast. Her right leg dragged slightly, a permanent reminder of a fall at the Darlington textile mill 40 years ago. They never fixed the staircase. They never paid her the full settlement. She never filed a lawsuit. Instead, she learned to limp with dignity. She learned to walk like nothing was broken. Every morning, cane in hand, she made her way through Forsyth Park like clockwork. Past the bronze fountain tourists fawned over, past the newsstand that hadn't sold a paper since 2019. Her cane, wooden, worn smooth by time, clicked steadily, a metronome against the old paths. It was more than a walking aid. It was memory. It was survival. It was the last thing her husband had crafted with his own hands before his lungs gave out from years working the docks. When he died, she didn't cry in public. She just walked harder. People in town called her Miss Evelyn. They nodded politely, offered soft smiles. She was that woman, with the shawls, the slow steps, and the unmatched memory. She remembered everyone's birthday, even those who didn't remember hers. But beyond that, she was invisible. That's the thing about being an older black woman in the South. You can live right in the heart of a city and still not be seen. Except someone was watching. And he didn't see resilience. He didn't see a woman who had outlived every kind of heartbreak. He saw a problem. But we'll get to him later. This story doesn't begin with a scream. It begins with silence. That morning, Evelyn rose at 5 like always, made her tea, jasmine steeped exactly 4 minutes, fed her cat Lila, buttoned her wool coat loop by loop the way her mother taught her. She didn't listen to the news anymore. Too much noise. Too many stories that felt like echoes of pain she'd already lived. She wasn't angry. Not really. She just wanted her walk. As she stepped out the door, a chill greeted her, soft but biting. Savannah was waking slowly. A jogger passed without looking. A delivery truck hummed in the distance. But Evelyn felt something, a tension in the air, a weight pressing down almost like a memory she couldn't name. Her cane tapped the bricks as she moved toward the park. Each step practiced patient. Her eyes scanned the early morning fog like it was keeping secrets. To the world, this was just another aging woman on a walk, but inside, her storms lived. She had raised 3 children during the era of school busing and sideways stairs. She'd watched her brother get dragged out of a voting line in 1964. She had seen justice postponed so many times she forgot what it looked like. And yet, she never stopped walking. She had a phrase she whispered under her breath every morning like a prayer. If I'm still standing, they haven't won. It wasn't bravado. It was survival. In her pocket was a folded photograph of her son, Julian Monroe, taken on the day he passed the bar. He stood in front of a courthouse in Chicago, fists raised, suit crisp, smile soft. He didn't visit often, his work kept him busy. Civil rights cases, class action suits people who had been buried by the system and needed someone who could speak in court without trembling. Evelyn was proud of him, but she never told anyone who he was. In Savannah, pride is something you carry quietly like grief. As she reached the center of Forsyth Park, near the iron benches beneath the massive oak tree, her cane caught briefly in a sidewalk crack. She paused. The same crack she'd stepped over for years. This time, it felt deeper. She didn't know that 2 blocks away, Officer Brett Landon was finishing his third black coffee of the morning. He'd already issued a parking citation, barked at a man for loitering outside a convenience store, and now he was cruising the edge of the park because some of these folks start getting weird early. That's what he said to his partner last week, laughing. He saw her from across the street. Small, slow, alone. And to him, that was enough. But Evelyn didn't see him. Not yet. Instead, she kept walking. Past the playground, still empty from winter chill. Past a young woman setting up a tripod by the fountain, filming some morning yoga video for the internet. Past the echoes of history, both beautiful and brutal. And that's when it happened. A crow flew low, sudden flapping above her head. Startled, she shifted her weight just slightly, and her cane slipped. The wooden handle cracked against the stone edge of the path. Not enough to break it, just enough to echo. A man across the path turned his head. Evelyn bent, slowly, picked it up, brushed off the dirt. And when she stood again, she wasn't alone. The officer was already approaching, fast, intentional. And in that moment, something shifted. The wind died, the city paused, and the crack in the sidewalk widened, not the one beneath her cane, but the one running through this country's idea of dignity, of safety, of who is allowed to simply exist in public without being questioned. What came next would shatter more than wood, but right then, all she could do was straighten her spine, steady her breath, and keep walking. She didn't know this would be the last quiet morning she would have for a long time. Or that someone just behind a nearby hedge had pressed record. The moment Officer Brett Landon stepped off the curb, something in the atmosphere recoiled. Not visibly, not loudly, but as if the morning itself sensed a violation in progress. The fog hadn't yet lifted from the pathways of Forsyth Park, and Evelyn Monroe stood in its soft gray cradle like a shadow from another time. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't need to. The rhythm of boots on concrete announced themselves with purpose, a kind of purpose Evelyn had come to recognize without ever needing to be told. "Ma'am," the voice called, clipped and official, hollowed of empathy. She paused, her cane balanced lightly against her palm. The tone wasn't curious, it was procedural. She turned only slightly, just enough to acknowledge she'd heard. Her back remained straight. "Is there a reason you're out here this early?" She blinked, confused for a moment. The question was so strange, so unnecessary, she thought perhaps she'd misheard. "I walk every morning, officer," she replied, with a quiet firmness, not deferential, but not aggressive either. Same as always. Do you live nearby? I do, she said. 3 blocks east, on Whitaker. He nodded slowly, as if her answer failed to satisfy something deeper in him. Something not rooted in policy, but in prejudice. His gaze dropped to the cane in her hand. He frowned. You know, there's been a few incidents around here. We're checking for suspicious activity. She tilted her head, amused more than offended. And you think I look suspicious? He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the distance in 2 sharp strides. The tension between them was sudden, electric thick as the moss above their heads. Evelyn didn't move. She knew the rules. When power stands in front of you in a uniform, the safest thing you can do is nothing. I need to see what you're holding there, he said, gesturing to her cane. This, she said, raising it slightly. It's a cane. My husband made it. Mind if I take a look? I do, actually. Something in his eyes changed then. A flicker annoyance, maybe disbelief. The gall of this old woman standing in a public park, not trembling in the face of his authority. Ma'am, for your safety and mine, I'm going to have to take that for inspection. Evelyn's hand tightened on the cane. For inspection, she echoed. It's not a weapon. Could be, he said flatly. It's a walking stick. And I'm asking nicely. She stared at him for a moment, measuring whether he knew what he was saying, or if the uniform had swallowed the man whole. You're not asking, she replied. You're assuming you have the right. That was the moment. Without another word, he reached forward. Fast. Too fast for her to react. His hand wrapped around the cane just below the handle, and for a breathless second they both held on. Her grip was firm, but his was determined. He yanked it once. She stumbled slightly. Her leg buckled not in weakness, but in surprise. She regained her footing. What are you doing? Her voice cracked not with fear, but with indignation, the sting of humiliation rising up her throat like bile. You're resisting, he said. No, I'm standing. And then it happened. The sound that would stay with her long after this morning ended. A sharp, cruel crack. The cane, her husband's cane, the one he shaped from old oak after his last shift on the docks, split in 2 like a branch underfoot. Gasps came not from her, but from the edges of the park. She turned instinctively toward the sound and realized in her peripheral vision that there were others. A jogger frozen mid-stride, a young woman crouched beside a tripod, a man in a sanitation uniform leaning on his broom. They were all watching. No one moved. Officer Landon dropped the broken halves of the cane at her feet like they were garbage. Next time, comply, he muttered, then added almost as an afterthought, This isn't personal, ma'am, just policy. He turned and walked away. Evelyn didn't bend immediately. Her body was frozen not in fear, but in fury. Her hands trembled, her mouth dry. Then slowly, with a grace learned only through years of standing tall in the face of casual cruelty, she knelt. One hand on the pavement, the other reaching for the cane pieces, her fingers brushing splinters like touching a memory she wasn't ready to let go of. She stood. She did not cry. She did not shout. She simply began to walk haltingly now, unsteady but upright through the winding path of Forsyth Park. Behind her, the silence echoed louder than any siren. The onlookers remained rooted, unsure of what they had witnessed, or perhaps unwilling to name it. But someone had named it. Lana Foster, the yoga instructor with the tripod, had pressed record just after the confrontation began. She hadn't meant to film anything controversial. She had simply felt her stomach twist, her instincts flare. She was young, white middle class, raised to trust police, but trained by life to doubt easy narratives. Something about the scene didn't sit right. The speed, the tone, the violence masked as professionalism. Later that day, Evelyn sat in her kitchen. The broken cane lay across her dining table like a corpse. She didn't speak. She didn't drink her tea. She simply stared at it as if trying to understand how something that had survived 25 years of use could be destroyed in a heartbeat by someone who saw it as disposable. When the knock came at her door that evening, she expected a neighbor. But it wasn't a neighbor. It was Lana. "I'm sorry," she said, holding out her phone. "I didn't know what else to do, but I recorded it. All of it." Evelyn looked at the young woman's face, genuine, apologetic, unsure. She reached out, pressed play. And as the video played, as the crack echoed once more through a tiny speaker, Evelyn did not flinch. She watched her own humiliation with the steadiness of someone who had known worse. But when it ended, she said something soft, nearly inaudible. "They always break something before they back away." Lana blinked. Evelyn looked up. But this time, she said they won't walk away unnoticed. In that moment, something shifted, not in Evelyn's leg or her voice, but in the very air around them. The break had happened, but the healing had not begun. Not yet. Julian Monroe was reviewing case briefs in his office on the 17th floor of a federal building in downtown Chicago when the video appeared in his inbox. The subject line was vague. "You need to see this." The sender, a name he didn't recognize, Lana Foster. Normally, he wouldn't have opened something like that. Spam, scams, threats. They were part of the background noise of public service. But something about it stopped him. A feeling. He clicked play. For the first 5 seconds, he didn't understand what he was watching. The camera was shaky, angled slightly from behind a park bench. Then he saw her, his mother, Evelyn, small in the frame, wearing the blue coat he'd given her last winter. She stood still, facing a police officer. Her voice wasn't clear, but her posture was. Straight, measured, defiant in its stillness. Then the cane snapped. The sound of it sliced through his chest like a blade. He didn't watch the rest. Didn't need to. By the time the video ended, Julian was already booking a flight to Savannah. He didn't call his mother. He didn't trust himself to speak without rage bleeding into every word. He just packed a bag and left the office without saying a word to anyone. The silence he carried with him onto the plane wasn't calm. It was concentrated fury, the kind that simmers deep, quiet, and purposeful. Back in Savannah, Evelyn didn't leave the house for 2 days. The pieces of her cane remained where she had placed them on the dining table, wrapped in a kitchen towel like something sacred. She moved more slowly now, not just because of the physical loss, but because her rhythm had been interrupted. Her walk had been more than exercise. It had been her prayer, her meditation, her rebellion. And now it was gone. The neighbors noticed. Her front porch remained still, the routine broken. Some stopped by with covered dishes and awkward glances. Others crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. Savannah had always been polite, but politeness was not the same as justice. Inside her home, the silence thickened. It wasn't peace. It was pause. The kind that follows a blow before the bruise forms. On the third morning, there was a knock. Not a gentle one. Purposeful. Firm. Evelyn opened the door to find Julian standing there, suitcase in one hand, eyes searching her face with a restraint that nearly crumbled the moment he saw the strain behind her smile. "I knew you'd come," she said, stepping aside to let him in. He looked around the house, so familiar, so unchanged, and then down at the table where the cane lay. "I saw it," he said softly. Evelyn sat slowly, hands folding into her lap, like they had something to hide. "I didn't want you to find out like that." Julian knelt beside her. "How else would I have found out, Mama, you weren't going to tell me?" "I didn't want it to be your burden," she said. "You're already carrying so much." "You're my mother," he said, voice cracking. "You are the reason I do what I do." They sat there in silence for a long moment, not needing to explain the history wrapped around them. It wasn't just about one incident. It was every slight, every indignity, every time someone called her dear in that condescending tone, or stepped around her in a grocery line like she was invisible. That night, Julian went for a walk through Forsyth Park. The path was the same, the crack in the sidewalk still there, and the bench where a woman had once knelt to pick up the remnants of something precious stood quiet, untouched. He sat there, phone in hand, and watched the video again. This time, he made himself watch to the end. The way she stood, even as the officer walked away. The way her fingers touched the broken wood as if trying to will it whole again. The way no one moved to help her. He knew what this meant. This wasn't just an assault on his mother. It was an assault on memory, on presence, on belonging. The next morning, Julian made calls. Not to the media. Not yet. He called old friends from the DOJ, colleagues in civil rights offices, a professor he once clerked under who specialized in systemic bias and patterns of misconduct. Quietly, strategically, he began to pull threads. Meanwhile, Evelyn's story was already beginning to ripple beyond their control. Lana had posted the video to Reddit, then to Twitter, a caption that read, "This isn't just about a cane. This is about who gets to feel safe in public." Within hours, it was shared over 40,000 times. Civil rights activists took notice. Local reporters began reaching out. The city's community boards exploded with debate. But the most unexpected reaction came from the people closest to home. At her weekly book club, which met every Thursday at Miss Carroll's porch, the mood had shifted. Women who'd never spoken about politics now found themselves raising their voices. "Did you see it?" one asked. "My son said it reminded him of what happened to his teacher in '89, said another. "I remember when they tried to arrest that man outside First Baptist for matching a description. He was just walking his dog. They weren't just talking about Evelyn. They were remembering their own cracks in the sidewalk, the invisible fractures they had stepped over for decades, pretending the ground was solid. And something began to shift." That Sunday, a group of young artists hosted a spoken word night in a local cafe. They titled the evening, "Names We Refuse to Forget." One performer, barely 20, read a piece called "The Cane." It wasn't about Evelyn specifically, but it was. When the poem ended, the room was silent, a kind of sacred silence. Then someone stood and said, "We should do something." By Monday, Evelyn's mailbox was full. Letters from strangers, notes left on her porch, flowers, handwritten cards with messages like, "Thank you for walking, even when the world tried to stop you." One letter signed only Walter, 76. Charleston read, "I saw myself in your silence, and I'm sorry I stayed quiet when I shouldn't have." Julian read every single one aloud to her. She didn't cry, but her voice when she finally spoke carried something deeper than tears. "I never wanted to be a symbol," she said. "You're not," Julian replied. "You're a mirror. You're making people see what they've ignored." She nodded slowly. "But now they've seen," he added. "So we can't stop here." The silence had been broken, and in its place, something far more powerful had begun to take shape momentum, not just for justice, but for truth. And truth, once it starts walking, is hard to stop. By the end of the week, the city that once ignored its fractures found itself staring directly into them. Savannah's charm, the slow drawl, the pastel porches, the old brick had long distracted from the structural cracks beneath. But now, something raw was showing, and it all started with a cane that had been broken in plain daylight. Julian Monroe wasn't a man who made noise for the sake of it. His courtroom presence had always been defined by restraint, by the kind of precision that left little room for interpretation. But Savannah wasn't a courtroom, and the case against Officer Brett Landon wasn't going to be won with closing arguments. This fight needed something more disruptive, something human. Within days of his return, Julian had built a loose coalition community. Leaders, civil rights attorneys, clergy members, even a few journalists who still believed local news could change things. But the most unexpected ally came from a place no one had anticipated: Lana Foster, the young yoga instructor who had recorded the video. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't an activist. But she had something powerful, an eye for storytelling, and an audience that trusted her. Together, Julian and Lana produced a short documentary, 5 minutes of raw footage intercut with voiceover photos of Evelyn and historical context on systemic abuse by local law enforcement. It wasn't slick. It wasn't polished. But it was honest. When the video went live on YouTube, it surpassed 100,000 views within the first 24 hours. More importantly, it hit home. The comments section flooded with messages not just of sympathy, but of shared experience. "I've seen it too," one wrote. Different city, same story. The mayor's office issued a statement, non-committal, carefully worded, a reminder that the city took all allegations seriously. But it wasn't enough. People were tired of statements. They wanted accountability. They wanted faces, names, consequences. That Saturday, a town hall meeting was held at a community center a few blocks from Forsyth Park. It had originally been scheduled as a neighborhood watch update, but word spread, and it turned into something else entirely. Julian took the stage after the third speaker, a young black father who described being handcuffed in front of his daughter for walking home too slowly. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "My mother was humiliated by a man in uniform," he began. "But what happened to her isn't rare. What's rare is that it was caught on camera. What's rare is that someone said, 'This time we won't let it go.' We're not asking for revenge. We're asking for honesty." After the applause faded, more stories came. People who had never spoken before now felt the pull of Evelyn's dignity. An older Latina woman recounted an officer threatening to tow her car unless she offered some respect. A former teacher described a student who dropped out after repeated stop and frisks. The air was thick with long-held pain, but beneath it was something else: momentum. In private, Julian worked to compile formal complaints. With legal partners, he tracked Officer Landon's record. There were gaps. Files missing reports, edited body cam footage that conveniently hadn't been running. But threads began to emerge. The broken cane wasn't the beginning. It was merely the moment that lit the fuse. Evelyn didn't attend the meetings, not because she didn't care, but because she understood something others were just beginning to grasp. True change doesn't always happen in the noise. It often grows in the quiet. So instead, she wrote letters, longhand and cursive her students used to admire, letters to legislators, to local officials, to a few other women she knew had stories of their own but hadn't found the courage to speak. But she did attend one event. A week after the town hall, under the shade of a massive oak in Forsyth Park, a new bench was unveiled. No fanfare, just neighbors, friends, and a few strangers who had been moved by her story. The plaque was small, but the message bold. For every step taken in strength, for every voice that rose after silence. The bench faced east toward the rising sun. Evelyn arrived with Julian at her side. She moved slowly, a new cane in hand, gifted by a local carpenter who had read about her in the paper. She ran her fingers along the plaque, letting the words sink into her skin. "I used to sit here," she whispered, "before anyone was looking." Julian nodded. "They're looking now." She sat down, the wood warm beneath her. Around her, the park hummed with life. Children chased bubbles. A jazz trio played in the distance. A man walking a dog stopped and tipped his hat. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn breathed deeply. Not to steady herself, but to feel the air differently. There was still work ahead. Investigations, politics, discomfort. But something had shifted. Not just in Savannah, in her. The bench wasn't a monument. It was a beginning. And it faced east, because that's where healing begins with the morning. The suspension of Officer Brett Landon was announced not with fireworks, but with a short press release posted late on a Thursday evening. The language was cautious, pending investigation standard protocol, but the meaning was unmistakable. He was off the streets. And for the first time in a long while, Savannah felt like it had exhaled. But Evelyn Monroe wasn't celebrating. She sat on her porch as the cicadas began their nightly hymn, watching the twilight melt into the branches of the oak trees. Julian sat beside her, a notebook open in his lap, filled with names, dates, and pages of testimonies he'd gathered from people who until recently had no voice. His work wasn't done. Neither was hers. They blinked. Mama Julian said quietly, echoing something he had once told her in the wake of the town hall. For the first time, the system blinked. Evelyn didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "Then we have to keep looking back at it," she said, "until it can't look away." The days that followed weren't filled with headlines or grand gestures. They were filled with porch conversations, church meetings, and calls between neighbors who had once passed each other silently. A young city councilwoman proposed new oversight guidelines. A group of students started a petition for mandatory body cameras. The town had cracked, and light was beginning to find its way through. But for Evelyn, the true shift wasn't in policy. It was in presence. One morning, she returned to Forsyth Park with her new cane, the same one she had leaned on when the bench was unveiled. But this time, she wasn't alone. A dozen others walked with her, some older, some younger, black, white, Latino. Some had been quietly carrying their own wounds. Some just wanted to say, "We see you." As they passed the cracked section of the sidewalk, she paused, then stepped over it like always. But this time, she turned to face those behind her. "This isn't just about me," she said, voice clear in the morning light. "It never was. It's about where we choose to stand when something breaks, whether we look away or lean in." She took one more step forward, and the others followed. No chants, no banners, just footsteps, purposeful, unapologetic. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive in thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly in the form of a woman who refused to be moved and a son who knew how to make the world listen. Together, they reminded a city and maybe even a country that real change begins not in noise, but in where we choose to stand when the silence ends. Evelyn Monroe never set out to become a symbol. She didn't march with banners, and she never spoke through megaphones. Her rebellion was quiet, deliberate walks at dawn, handwritten letters, the simple act of moving through a world that often looked past women like her. What happened to her that morning in Forsyth Park wasn't extraordinary because of its cruelty. Sadly, it was ordinary, another instance of power flexing itself on the most unprotected. But what followed was extraordinary, a community choosing not to look away. Her cane was more than wood. It was history, dignity, memory. When Officer Brett Landon snapped it in half, he wasn't just breaking an object, he was testing the silence that often follows injustice. But Evelyn didn't scream. She didn't retaliate. She walked home. And in that walk, in her choice to remain upright and unshaken, she sparked a ripple that reached far beyond Savannah. A stranger captured the moment. Her son returned home. Stories surfaced. Voices rose. And what began as a personal humiliation became a collective reckoning. Julian Monroe could have stayed in Chicago. He could have processed his anger in legal briefs from afar, but he came home not as a savior, but as a son, one who understood that legacy is not just about law and reputation. It's about standing where it matters most, especially when others won't. Together, mother and son did not chase vengeance. They pursued clarity. They insisted that pain must be acknowledged, not hidden behind polite avoidance or institutional excuses. Their story wasn't about taking down a man in uniform. It was about lifting up the people, a system repeatedly overlooks. From silent neighbors who finally spoke to strangers who joined Evelyn on her morning walks, a shift took root. The crack in the sidewalk, the literal one and the metaphorical one, had always been there. But this time, people chose to see it. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. So what is the lesson? It's this: you don't have to shout to stand for something. You don't have to lead a movement to start a change. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is keep walking. With your story, with your truth. Even when the world tells you to sit down, stay quiet, move on, the sidewalk may be cracked. But your presence, your insistence on being seen, heard, and valued can remind everyone around you what dignity really looks like. And in today's world, where injustice often moves faster than compassion, Evelyn's story is a call to slow down, to notice, and to act. Look around. Listen deeply. Speak up, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's uncomfortable. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Stories like Evelyn's. Stories that remind us that justice begins with presence and change begins with us. So stay connected, stay aware, and most of all, keep walking.